Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Made Possible by Pop Culture, the podcast. Once again, I'm your host and producer, Danielle Turchiano. And if you're watching this on YouTube, yes, I need a haircut. Yes, I have a sunburn. It's finally nice here in Los Angeles. I sat outside. I have no regrets. Anyway, getting into the actual reason you're here, the podcast. If you don't remember, or you just want a refresher, this is where I ask my guests to come on and pick something from their childhood pop culture that greatly influenced who they were as a person, maybe even who they grew up to be professionally. And then we talk about something from that world today that is just as influential, if not also exciting. So I'm really excited to just get into it with all of you today and my guest, very special guest, Scott Huver. He's a prolific writer. I'm sure you have seen his name in a million different bylines: Variety, Hollywood Reporter, People, CNN, et cetera, et cetera. He's also the author of the forthcoming book, Beverly Hills Noir: Crime, Sin, Scandal in 90210. That's going to come out in October. And so I think you all need to just put it on your list now. I'm excited to read it. Hopefully we can all talk about it then. But for now, welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Danielle. Good to see you.
It was a long, rambling intro from me. How are you?
I'm doing great. Always excited to talk about Star Trek.
I was just going to say we can get into it. I always usually ask my guests to set up what it is that they wanted to talk about. Although I will say that from the minute I emailed you to say, please come on my podcast, I was like, I already know what he's going to say. And now I just need to figure out the specifics, because go ahead, it's Star Trek, but it's such a big, I'm sorry for this pun, enterprise that, I mean, you could start anywhere and talk for days. So you set this up. When did you get into Star Trek for the first time?
It's so funny because when I was a little kid, I watched an episode of Star Trek. I was probably 5 or 6, and it scared the crap out of me. It was one of the earliest episodes called The Man Trap, where one of the beautiful women on the show is revealed to be a salt-sucking monster, alien monster. And the transformation freaked me out so much that I wouldn't watch Star Trek for years afterwards. And every time I would turn it on to watch it, it would be that damn episode every single time. So it wasn't until after Star Wars had come out and I was desperate for anything space that I could watch, that I finally bit the bullet and said, okay, I'm not going to let this show freak me out anymore, and started watching it. And that, combined with the release of Star Trek the Motion Picture, made it feel like kind of zeitgeisty. It was, Star Trek was back. It was exciting. And that was sort of my gateway into it when I was, about 10, 11 years old. And eventually I became not so much the convention going, like that kind of wanting to participate so much in Star Trek, but I just was fascinated by the elements of it. Like it was one of the few TV shows at the time when I was growing up that there was a decent amount of information about, that you could read about. There were, science fiction genre magazines for film and television always had something on Star Trek.
Right.
In the 80s. There were books, Gene Roddenberry had written a book about the making of Star Trek. So that was, between that and on the film side, Star Wars, that was my gateway into really learning about how things are made, how Hollywood works as a business, as a production entity, and also how writers work and how they used something like Star Trek to couch other stories in fiction clothes. And so that was my entree into it. And by the time I was a teenager and the movies were in full swing, and then the Next Generation came out, I was completely sucked in.
So I do want to go back to a couple of things you said that I find interesting. The fact that you got into Star Trek a little bit after Star Wars. I mean, there's always those jokes around, like, are they different? Obviously, they're different. No one on the internet needs to yell at us. We know that. But because you are in this kind of, I want to say, space state of mind, maybe, do you feel like that's what you were looking for, just another show set in space, and that is what led you to go back to Star Trek? Or did you already kind of know, well, Star Trek is doing these stories that have moralities tales or philosophical discussions, and that was something you were interested in? Like, maybe it's a chicken and egg question, I don't know.
I was definitely looking for lasers and spaceships,
Okay.
but found great stories and really interesting characters. That was the bonus. I mean, I was just a little kid, so I was just give me some, something blowing up and something zipping through, next to a planet, and I was happy. But there was so much more depth and so much more content, really. Like Star
Yeah.
Wars is great, still love Star Wars, but it's just they're apples and oranges.
Yeah.
One is kind of an experience, visually, with a lot of fun, interesting things to think about. But Star Trek always scratches way deeper than the surface, and that's, I think, as somebody who is really on his way to becoming a writer, that
Mhm.
appealed to me a lot. And I was very visual. I was As a kid, I was always drawing and you know that kind of thing. So there was a combination. I love drawing the spaceships, love drawing the uniforms, like figuring out twists and tweaks and stuff. So that was part of it. That was my, I guess, interactivity.
And when you were, you said 10 or 11, how much were you from those very first moments of rewatching past that episode that scared you, picking up on some of those other deeper things right away and either feeling like, oh, I'm learning something here, or at least acknowledging, if you were at all, that this is more than space and lasers? Was that something that was happening? Do you feel like as you were watching, or did that come later when you like reflected on your experience as a younger person watching?
Think that it was hitting me at a time where I was getting it as it happened. And I'm a child of really 70s television,
Mm,
and I think primed to take away lessons from the
yeah.
TV I was watching. And I was a voracious reader, so I was reading, TV Guide cover to cover, and so I knew from like the Norman Lear sitcoms and the MTM things that there was more to television than just the punchlines and the jokes. There was something baked into it. So I was ready by the time I started really watching Star Wars closely, or Star Trek closely, at like age 11, maybe 12. That's I was ready for it, and so and the movie was really set up that way too. The
Yeah.
Star Trek the motion picture, as I know a lot of people think it's boring, but I was, a lot of cool space stuff in there, and there was a good, easy to digest message
Mhm.
for somebody my age, and that helped me be able to be ready for, episodes of the 60s show that were more like, this is really about the Vietnam War. I mean, I grew up on MASH, so I was
Mm.
ready for
Well, part of the reason I'm asking is because you had mentioned that you already were on your way to being a writer, which maybe that is why, you correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe that is why then seeing the quality writing on Star Trek kept you going down that road, because you were learning about the production value and how writing can help build better TV. But at the same time, I'm also hearing you say you were understanding these deeper lessons. And to me, I would say, well, maybe I would walk away and say, I want to do something in that world. I want to be a philosopher. I want to be a change maker in a different way. Do you feel like the show influenced you in that way at all, in terms of having you think about different options for what you could do professionally?
for sure. I was, even in high school, I remember having to write a paper for a history class, and it was, I didn't really know, I didn't want to be bored by my own writing. And
Yeah.
so I wrote the paper on a wing and a prayer through the framework of Star Trek, where I had to write about like collective farming and communism in Russia. And I'm like, how do I even care about this? And I basically wrote the paper as if the Star Trek Enterprise crew had come across a planet that had an old fashioned system like communist Russia.
Mm,
They were explaining it to each other. It was like one scene out of an episode of Star Trek. I got an A. My
wow.
teacher was very generous in accepting
No, I
that
think when
way.
you can get creative with assignments like that and show you understand the assignment so well, you can not just regurgitate it back in textbook form. That is probably exciting to your teacher, but I think like you also kind of just wrote part of a spec script too, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah. And that really helped me see that there were other options for this uh, minor obsession I had with Star Trek,
Mm,
is that there are other ways that I could make use of it in my life. And I think that kind of started to flourish in college, when I was, I had one foot in journalism, one foot in English, and one foot in film and television in my
mhm.
studies. and I started to, really understand, like, there's so many things. Even if I don't necessarily become a screenwriter, I could become a journalist that writes about this kind of thing. This is the stuff that's exciting. I could work in production as an artist. I could be designing costumes or spaceships or whatever it is. And that Star Trek really set me up to kind of, because of my deep interest in it, to kind of pick apart what about it I might be able to kind of make my own.
And what would you say, can you pick a favorite child in terms of like a character that you felt like early on you either really identified with, or just that was the character you kept coming back to say, I want to see what they're up to next, I want more from?
It's definitely, it's shifted a bit,
Mm,
because from the original series, I was always drawn to McCoy.
okay.
McCoy, I think primarily because he was the funny one. He was the one who made the most jokes, and had sort of a irascibility to him that I liked. And he also was the mouthpiece for the more humanistic arguments that an individual episode of Star Trek might be making. He was always kind of leading from the gut, and I liked that aspect of him. As it has gone on, I really gravitate now to Kirk, surprisingly, because he's the guy who has to weigh all the options. He has to listen to McCoy's arguments on the humanistic side, and he has to listen to Spock's arguments on the logical side and the utilitarian side, and sometimes practical, but a little cold-blooded. And so Kirk has become more of a fascinating character, and he also, to me, embodies that 60s spirit. That it's kind of the American exceptionalism seen through the prism of Starfleet.
Wait, I just want, when you say, has become, are you talking about in the more recent series, or are you talking about when you rewatch the older Star Trek series that you first watched as a child?
As I rewatch and reflect.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you how you feel about like the different actors who have embodied them, and how that also influences, if it does, how you feel about characters. Has that changed at all in terms of who you like the most?
Like, as they've changed casting?
Yeah, in the different series, in the different movies.
Oh, yeah. So, I think in the movies, Carl Urban is practically channeling.
I've heard a lot of people say that. I do want to maybe just preface this by saying that I was excited to talk about Star Trek with you because you're such a fan and because you've written about it, including at publications I've worked for. I didn't grow up watching it. And so I also love having these conversations because I only come at it now as an adult. And so to when I would hear people say things like what you just said, he's channeling the original actors or he's channeling the original performance, I don't have a frame of reference for that. I just think like, oh, what a skill he has. So I love learning about, all of these different pieces. I will also say that well, we'll get there. I was like, I will say I struggle sometimes with the space of it all. So I do want to talk more about that, but we'll get there. Continue about Carl. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, Carl just, there's the cat. I wish I could pull out of my brain who cast the 2009 Star Trek movie, but they did such a great job, particularly Carl Urban as McCoy and Zachary Quinto as Spock. He's also spot on. And I had the rare and like blessed opportunity to interview Leonard Nimoy and Zachary Quinto together when that movie came out, which was amazing. And Chris Pine is a very different actor from William Shatner, but he catches something special, and it's a different Kirk. It's a Kirk who didn't grow up as regimented and demanding of himself because the timeline changed, but he makes that switch work. I also like what's going on Strange New Worlds with Ethan Peck. I think does a good job as a young Spock, and I'm enjoying watching him figure out how he's going to evolve that into where Leonard Nimoy starts the show.
That's what is so interesting about this too, is that when you get into the timeline of it all and the prequels and there's something to be said for, you want the actor to make the character their own, but they can only do so much to a degree, because you're not just watching something going, I know who that character should be emotionally. You're saying, I know who he should be because I know where he goes. I think that's such a hard job. I don't know how anyone does that.
Yeah. And, I don't think it's overstating it too much to say these characters are really becoming classic and even
Yeah.
mythic. And it's kind of like seeing, Olivier's Hamlet
Mm,
versus Mel Gibson's Hamlet versus Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet. Like, it's always going to be interesting to see somebody interpret it.
hmm.
Because these characters were introduced on television, I think that it's always going to be a little harder than like something like Shakespeare, where we do have an idea pretty entrenched in our brains.
Yeah.
So if you can summon up some sort of essence and then put a little top spin on it, that is going to keep the franchise alive. It's going to keep it lively. Like Anson Mount is a very different
Mm,
actor than Jeffrey Hunter, even though we only know him from like the 2-part reworked pilot of Star Trek. But there's something that he carries in common with
mm.
that take and with the take that we see in the J.J. Abrams movies too on Chris Pike. Like, it's really actors. I try to get them to talk about it, and I know
Yeah, me too.
it's difficult for them to even express how they do it. It just happens.
Right. And I mean, I think that's why I think, fascinating to hear them try to explain it, because I don't understand it at all. So
Yeah.
even if they say, I don't really know how I do it, I like hearing that acknowledgement that, okay, I'm not insane for not understanding how you do it, because there's a level of art to that, but I think there is also a level of, some of it is innate to how they're interpreting something. And I don't know. I've learned throughout my career, I interpret things differently than a lot of people. So I would be a terrible actor. No, I do want to talk about space for a second, because that is the piece of this that got you sort of back into Star Trek, even when the prosthetics scared you a little bit. Um, I will say that for myself, growing up, I always struggled a lot with like the sci-fi, the fantasy genres, because things were set so far away. They were delivering these, I knew they were delivering these great stories and these great messages of morality and societal issues and things like that. But I came from the attitude of like, I want to see that in our worlds. Like, I want to, because we need it. We need to fix our worlds. And I think sometimes people need to see it reflected. And I'm curious for you what the space element was for you, if it was the opposite of what I'm saying. Like, I like that it's not so heavy handed. I like that they're able to deliver these messages in a far out place, or if it was just, I like the cool visuals. What did that do for the viewing experience slash how much you connected versus escaped?
Yeah. So I think you start with me with the whiz bang of it all. Coming again as a kid who saw Star Wars in the theater at probably the best possible age to be able to be introduced to
Yeah.
that. There was a lot of the whiz bang that I was craving of space, and that was starting to become, as a result of the success of Star Wars. You were seeing like Battlestar Galactica and Buck Rogers and things like that on television. So there was that. Now Star Trek doesn't offer a lot of whiz bang.
Mm.
It did in the 60s, but budgets being what they were and special effects being where they were, there's only so much that you get in the original series.
But
And
even them being on a spaceship is,
yeah,
different enough. The art design of it is, I think, I don't know what their budget was, but I think they did a good job with what it looked like and with the buttons looking all functional.
yeah, if you go back and research how they went about it, I mean, they really studied.
Yeah.
They really tried to imagine what the future was going to be like, rather than be like, say, Lost in Space, which was just a bunch of, let's just make it look spacey.
Mm.
This was like, let's think it out. Roddenberry was a military man and a former police officer, and he respected the idea of chain of command and the efficiencies of military organization. And Starfleet is not exactly that, but that's the grounding point. So they built the equipment in a sense to work, to have practical application, and also to be relatable for that audience in the 60s, many of whom had been served in World War II. And whether they were military by nature, they were drafted and they had to fight in the wars. And so they understood that framework very well too. So there's that. Then for me, I mean, I'm of an age, I remember as a really small child seeing the last moon landing on television.
Mm.
And so there was still a lot of enthusiasm for space exploration. I grew up in the heyday of the space shuttle program. So there was a lot of that, that was still, the echoes of that were still reverberating pretty loudly,
Mm.
even though it was at its peak when Star Trek was on the air. And a lot of people attribute the enthusiasm for the moon landing when it happened, to getting it done, was because Star Trek played a part in that. JFK set the mandate, and Star Trek fueled the imagination, and everybody got there. So there was still a little bit of that buzz when I was a kid,
Yeah.
that informed thinking that was an exciting place to be, something on the frontier and the horizon of space exploration. And Star Trek took it further and said, here we are out there, now what do we do?
Mm. And you mentioned obviously that like there was a time in your life when you were you had your feet in different, or your hands in different places in terms of what you could do next professionally. Do you feel like, this might sound a little crazy, but do you feel like everything you just talked about, did you ever consider space, like joining a program, trying to be the next conqueror is maybe not the right word, but on the next expedition?
Not so much like if you gave me, if Jeff Bezos called me and offered me a seat, the
Well,
answer is
now I meant
yes.
it's
The answer
different
is
now.
yes. Back then, I didn't, I thought about what it would be like, but I didn't think of it. It still seemed so far away with how
Mm,
rare it was for somebody to go into space, and
yeah.
that they had to have such a science minded background, and like that. As much as I love speculative fiction and that kind of science, my brain is very much in the other direction. And so I always thought, I remember when I was a kid, I heard something like the next generation of astronauts might be like writers and artists and poets,
Mm,
so that they can interpret space for the people who haven't gone yet. And I'm like,
that's
that
cool.
sounds like a cool idea. That I'd be into. But yeah, that never, and also having a stepfather who served 3 tours of duty in
Yeah.
Vietnam, I was steered very far away from the military as a
Yeah.
result of his experiences.
Yeah, I could understand that. And I mean, I think maybe you made the right choice there.
I did think about being like a cop, which is sort of
Yeah.
akin. Roddenberry was a cop, um, because I don't know, that was a path, and then I kind of got a little bit of that fantasy by being
Yeah.
a police and crime journalist for a
I was
while.
I was just gonna say, I mean, especially and with your new book too. I mean, it's
Yeah,
still in you even today.
yep.
So you mentioned
And
earlier
fun
that you're
fact,
oh,
fun fact that when I was covering the police department in Beverly Hills, the chief of police at the time, Marvin Iannone, had worked directly with Gene Roddenberry when he was a police officer for LAPD. They knew each other very well.
small world. I
Yep.
mean, also small world, but also like pretty cool to get the both of them as sources on each other, I think, for stories that you're doing. That's rare and interesting. Now, you mentioned that you were not necessarily like a con goer. You weren't. Do you consider yourself a Trekkie? Like, how did you feel about that documentary? I feel like we need to talk about that documentary.
I'm I'm pretty hardcore in some respects. Like as a kid growing up, I would read all the licensed novels that would come out. That was a big deal in the 80s and
Mhm.
90s. Um, and I read all the comic books, and I didn't have to have every bit of merch. If the merch had a story to it, though, I was in. I would count me in. And I would get every making of and every magazine that had something to do with it, with Star Trek. But the cons, I suppose, I grew up, an hour and a half away from Detroit. I probably could have found a con to go to, but weirdly, I wasn't using Star Trek as a way to connect with other people.
Oh, I don't think that's weird.
Yeah, it's like people do that, and I think that's
Totally.
my
But I mean,
wife.
everybody's fandom is, I think, a little bit different. Some
Yeah, my
people,
my
it's like
wife
more for
definitely.
me.
She and her family, went to conventions. The whole family was into Star Trek. I was kind of the only one in my family, so
Mm.
that was probably felt like it was my thing. I had one good friend. I mean, Star Trek was having a renewed popularity as I was getting to be in my late teens, early 20s. But I had one good friend who was probably as into it as me, and we shared, and a couple other people. We shared it a little bit, but I didn't do the role-playing games or anything like that.
Mm.
But now that I have been to conventions, I get the fun of it for sure. Like, I totally understand it. And to be able to, when they have guests who have been on the show or been behind the scenes on shows, like that's something that would have gotten me excited had I thought it through more as a kid.
Mm. Well, I mean, it's also a very expensive endeavor when you're a child. You're not controlling your own finances. But you've seen the documentary, yes?
Yeah.
Do you feel like they captured your vibe? Like, or do you feel like there are even more types of Trek fans, maybe even including the way that you're a fan, that wasn't included in that? And granted, that documentary now is decades old. Maybe it's
Yeah.
time for a redo, but do you feel like you were represented in it?
I think that the documentary was fair. Like I think it had a good spectrum. Obviously, the more fun is the more out there people get,
Mm.
the more obsessive or completist, or the more escapist. I mean, you could see some people, some of those things are very, very moving, even when they seem kind of silly on the surface. When you see that this person needed Star Trek,
Right.
and I think we see it more and more every day. It doesn't have to be Star Trek, but it could be Game of Thrones, or it
Yep.
can be Twilight,
Yeah.
like
I mean, I covered Supernatural. I mean, Supernatural, I think, is
yeah,
the new Star Trek in that the conventions, the level of fandom, the merchandise, like the way that people literally have said this show has saved my life.
yeah. And so I think that with all the silliness that can come with that, and that maybe especially when Trekkies was made, that draws in
Mm.
the casual viewer. I think they still addressed like that this is important to people for various reasons. And also, touching on think of all the people. I love to talk to the actors about this, the people who went into their career paths
Yeah.
specifically because they were inspired by Star Trek, whether that be Hollywood, as mine kind of is, or became a doctor or a physicist or an astronaut. I mean, or an actor. Like it's really uncanny how the impact that this one little TV series that was on for 3 seasons has managed to have. And truly, when it gets down to it, for the betterment of the world, because
Yeah.
it's
Well,
making people happy.
and it's not just, I mean, we're talking about Star Trek, but then there's Next Generation, there's Discovery, there's all of the subsequent series. It's not just one show anymore. It is a franchise, but it is also generations, literally. I mean, I don't have children, but if I did, they could be experiencing a new generation of Star Trek from the one that I would have watched originally. Like that to me is, I think, the mind-boggling piece of this is just how not just the original can stand the test of time, but now we're still keeping it going and trying to make sure that all of it will stand the test of time.
Yeah. Foundationally, Star Trek is so strong because it is an optimistic view of the
Mm.
future,
Mm.
and at heart, and you get the adventure element and the science fiction element, and you get the thoughtful, metaphoric elements. And it changes depending on the era that it's made in. It changes depending on the creators behind the scenes, or the
Yeah.
actors on the screen, or the audience that's watching it. But the foundation remains like unbreakable in a sense. And it ebbs and flows, and we just kind of came out of a big dystopian pop culture period.
I Yes, and I love the pop culture dystopia. I love dystopia in, I shouldn't say in general, because if our world is inching there, and I won't love it if our world gets to where we've seen it in pop culture, but I genuinely love stories about that. So when you're
Well, there's
talking
so
about
much more
the hope,
dramatic. Yeah,
yeah. When
there's
you're
so
talking
much.
about the hope and the optimism of Star Trek, and I think maybe that's also a little bit of what I used to struggle with in the show, is like I'm not innately a hopeful, optimistic person. So I struggled to be like, how are you like that in the future? Like, is the future really better? No, probably not. So I struggled with the trying to get myself to believe it.
When you go back to the original show, I think you see some of the building blocks of that positive future were just the very fact that characters like Uhura and Sulu were
Mm.
part of the bridge command crew. And I think it was Whoopi Goldberg who, as a little girl, just was Star
Oh,
Trek,
yes.
and just it sang to her, and it's because it told her that Black people had a place in the future,
Yep.
and a place of equality, and that has been such a part of Star Trek through every incarnation. There's always an other. There's always somebody
Mhm.
on the outside who needs to feel included. And so when the show, even subtly, just by somebody's very presence, tells
Mhm.
you the future is better than it is right now because this person is sitting here, that's
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 true.
amazing.
Yes, in that respect, absolutely. Yeah, that is true.
And
I'm gonna make you pick your favorite child again, though, because now just for everyone at home, when Scott and I were talking about this episode, he sent me what he considers recommended viewing. And I want you, Scott, now for the people at home, if you had to give them one episode, maybe they missed it because they were not born yet. Maybe they missed it because they didn't think they'd be interested in it, but maybe now they want to check it out. One essential episode. Can you narrow it down?
we're so I think I'm not alone in saying that this is probably the single greatest episode of Star Trek, and that is City on the Edge of Forever.
Okay.
Um, and it's not so much, it's a little different. It's definitely science fiction in nature, but it's not necessarily space exploration in nature like much of the rest of the series. But it uses the time travel device
Yeah.
to to send the characters back to the 1930s, a sort of dystopian time in our own history, and sets up a situation where if things aren't changed, a worse dystopian future
Hmm.
lies ahead for humanity. The problem is that Kirk is faced with this amazingly dramatic dilemma. While back in the past, searching for a time lost Dr. McCoy, he and Spock encounter Joan Collins's character Edith Keeler, who is a missionary and this open-hearted, woman who's doing good for the world. Kirk can't help but fall in love with her. The problem is that if she does not die, this dystopian future will come to pass, and it's just an ideal time travel dilemma to have.
Well, I think
And
it's an ideal dramatic dilemma in general. Like, will you put your own wants and maybe needs above the good of the collective?
yep, and I think that the beauty of it, given that we talk about the optimism that
Mhm.
Star Trek is known for, this is a lot of realism.
Mhm.
Spoiler alert for those who haven't seen the episode, but it culminates with Kirk having to make a really, really hard decision, and he has to let her, experience her fate,
Right.
and have go back to his time and let the future play out as it now was intended to. And it's devastating. It's devastating for him. It's devastating for McCoy, who doesn't quite understand when he sees what happens.
Mm.
And Spock gets it, um, which is when Spock gets it, it's cutting deep, right? And I think that realism is also part of what Star Trek was. Is
Mm.
it's like it's not afraid to tell you, okay, there are not easy decisions,
Right.
um, and not everything's going to be perfect. And that was really never. It's just the idea that we've already gotten to a better future in Star Trek, and we're still trying to make it even better. We don't stop. We keep trying to perfect ourselves. I know in like the Next Generation, in the early seasons, there was a lot of trouble behind the scenes because Roddenberry was insisting that humanity had solved all its own problems, and like the characters all got along, and that's what he thought, and like the problems were now external on how we face these other cultures. That
Mhm.
created problems, and I don't think even Roddenberry realized that so much of the fun was the conflict between Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, and them hashing out
Yeah.
argument. And he kind of wanted to take that. Oh, he was older. He didn't see that when he was doing Next Generation. He wanted to take out that element of conflict among the regular cast. Once he kind of stepped back and they had a little more latitude,
Mm.
the actors were really pushing for it. And you see, they still work within a command structure. They're
Yeah.
still on the same side. They just occasionally have very strong disagreements.
Right. I mean, you need that for storytelling, but I mean, I think also you need that because there's no world where you would always get along with anyone in your life, be it your coworker, be it your family, be it your friend. Like there's always going to be something.
Yeah. except journalists, we all get along.
And we always get along with publicists, always. That came up on
I married one, so I do.
Yeah, but that's one. That's not the collective. So I touched on this, that like you not only were a fan for years, you've parlayed it into being able to write about Star Trek, not necessarily always the original because it's no longer on, and maybe anniversary stories are harder to sell, but the collective franchise as it's evolved and is ongoing and current today. Is there, I guess I want to talk a little bit about how that came about for you, in the sense of if there were moments in your career where you felt like you didn't want to write about it because you loved it too much, that maybe you didn't want to know too much about the behind the scenes because it would ruin the experience, or was it the opposite? Was it you always said, I have to write about this because I love it so much, I want to know everything and share why it's so worth talking about and watching?
Definitely more the latter. The one thing that I think I have avoided is reviews and doing anything where I'm critiquing it, which is something that I'm getting further and further away from, because I'm like, the old trope, but it's true. Nobody's trying to make something bad.
Sure, but they make things that are bad all the time.
But they make things that are bad all the time.
If you point it out, you can help them fix it.
Yes.
Not the thing that they've already made because it's already out, but for the next time.
Yeah. But otherwise, like I was down. Like my first proper job in entertainment reporting, my office was on the Paramount lot next door to where they were shooting Enterprise, at the same time that they were shooting the last Next Generation movie, Nemesis. So I would come to work and go up the stairs, and there'd be someone in full Klingon outfit smoking a cigarette on a break. I would go and play with the dogs that played Captain Archer's beagle.
I mean, honestly, the dogs are the best part of any show, so it's amazing.
I was primed to start writing about Star Trek. So I started there. And of course, because I was my company was part owned by Paramount at the time. So it was like, they were all for it. Like, so I could do things. I was able to hit the ground running, like any chance I could get with Star Trek. I was able to do. And then, it constantly ebbs and flows, like where it is in the culture and how active it is in production. The best was when JJ's film came out in 2009, and I got an assignment from People to interview, to not just work on that movie, but to interview everyone from the original cast that was still with us. That was fantastic. Yeah. I must have spent an hour and a half on the phone with Nichelle Nichols. She was in Germany, had just got done with a convention there, and was ready to tell me all kinds of cool stuff about her life. And Shatner's been good to me. Leonard Nimoy was always wonderful to me. So that was great to get to the people who did it back when, and occasionally still get to do it.
Right.
But also to work with people like George Takei when he was on Heroes, or subsequent shows, or when he just kind of became this sort of cultural figure in and of himself. Right. That's all happened since I've been doing this, and to get other sides of them has been fun. I mean, there was an instance where I was asked to moderate a panel at a convention here in Los Angeles, and in the green room, the actors were talking about Picard about a year and a half before it came out.
Oh yeah.
No news about it whatsoever. And I don't think they realized that I was a journalist, and I had to sit on that. For so long. But
it's nice to have kind of that inside scoop.
Yeah.
Inside, like you feel like you're more a part of this thing that you love. And I feel like sometimes it's just nice to build these relationships, build that trust, and say, when you're ready, we can do this officially, but I'm enjoying being a part of this now on a little less officially, hearing it, you know what I mean? Just hearing it as you would talk about it, like around the table for dinner with your friends.
And I guess the beauty of being a freelancer for as long as I have, because I think I've been full-time since about 2008. Every time I come at Star Trek, I tend to be doing it for a different outlet. And, and different outlets have different needs. And so like when I was working with you at like Variety and other places, like there was more, let's get to the nitty gritty of the putting it together side of things. But if I'm working for People, it's like, I want to know your human experience. I want to know like your personal, how is what's the dividends or the detractions from your life that Star Trek has brought to you, that those kinds of things. Other places are just story, spoiler, and so it's fun to be able to wear different hats
Yeah.
and come at it from different angles. I've never had a place where Star Trek's been like my beat, where I cover it constantly, which I don't know what that would do to me.
I was just gonna say, I feel like that might take some of the fun out of it in a way, because I'll speak for myself. I mean, when I had certain shows that were my beat, even if I loved them, if they were my favorite show, sometimes just the stress of like having someone breathe down your neck when you don't get the scoop, when you aren't the one to break the news, ruins it. Because it's just, and sometimes the news that you're breaking is like, oh man, I would have rather watched that play out on screen. I wish we didn't report this too early, which is, when you're a fan and a reporter, I think always something that you're kind of towing the line of, because if the publicists are agreeing that it's okay to publish it as news, and you should, for traffic reasons, obviously, and to get people to tune in. But at the same time, there have definitely been guest stars that I've reported on as like exclusive castings that I'm like, oh, now I know exactly how that episode's about to play out. It's like the Law and Order effect. Like, that person's in it. Oh, they're the killer. Like, you know what I mean?
And also there's stuff that's not news that you kind of get pressured to put out there because the publicists in the studio or the network want you to, and you're like, well, this isn't that big a deal.
Well, that too. I mean, I will say, as an editor, I was always like, there's no story here. No. Like, I wish there was something more. Give me something more, and we can put this in as well. But yeah, sometimes the things they want you to push, I'm just like, I don't work for you. I work for a publication. That's not anything for us. Maybe it's something for another publication, as you were speaking to, like the different, vibes and beats and things like that. You did, though, talk a lot about how working through the years at different publications, you're talking to a lot of the same people. They get to know you, even if they don't necessarily care what publication you're working for. Did you ever feel like you had to disclose like the level of fan you were of the show? Or did you want to keep it kind of church and state separate because you're coming to talk to them as a professional?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think if I've ever full on. I think in conversation with people, I think I've made it pretty clear that I'm fairly knowledgeable.
Sure.
Right. About the franchise, and about people's individual paths in their life. I don't know that I've ever really sat down and sort of professed where I come from as a fan. Like I would have liked the opportunity to do it with like Gene Roddenberry in particular. He passed away before I got into this business, but and I felt like I got a little bit there with Nimoy, because I did talk to him quite a bit when he was on Fringe. And he was always very generous with his time, and a very thoughtful man. Shatner I probably interviewed the most, but I feel like I've always had a feeling that professing a deep fandom might not be the best.
With Shatner. I think maybe now it's a little different.
Yeah. And the bill that you get on any given day also depends on how you approach things. Like,
well, and that's I think a good part of this too, and a little bit of why I asked. Like you said, you made it clear that you were knowledgeable, and I mean, I think knowledge is the key to proving yourself as a journalist. Even when you're not a fan of something, you have to do your research before you go into interviews. But I do think that there are certain people in this industry that if you come at them saying, I'm such a fan, they immediately have different responses, whether good or bad. And maybe they're going to hold back in an interview, or maybe they're going to give you the story, they're going to think you want a different story than what you really want. So I'm not saying you should or shouldn't do it. I always just like to ask these questions because I think we all have different stories, not just as who we are as journalists and fans, but also as who we are with what show. We might approach some people on certain shows differently.
One actually, it just occurred to me that one did happen earlier this year, when I was covering the Saturn Awards, and I was speaking with Terry Metalis, Todd Stashwick, Michelle Hurd,
nice,
from Picard, and that third season, we did our, it was red carpet, so it was kind of rushed, kind of chaotic with stuff going on around us, but we did a quick chat, and then I had to tell them, I'm like, because the I had gotten a set of preview episodes before the show hit, and I was going through a really rough patch where I'd been in the hospital myself. My stepfather had passed away the day I got out of the hospital. It was a really rough time for me and my family, and it'd been a few days since everything had hit, and we were in an Airbnb in Michigan, where I'm from. My wife and my mother-in-law and I said, I've got these issues. We all love Star Trek. I'm like, I've got these new episodes of Picard. You want to check them out and like just watch like one or two and see, finish off the night that way. And we were like, okay. We ended up watching every episode. It was because we loved it so much, and it was also such a great relief from what we had been going through personally. And so I told those guys that when I saw them at the Saturn Awards, and they were, as people in the Star Trek franchise are now want to be, they were so kind, and like asked me, the first thing they said are like, is everything better now? And it's like they know, even newbies like Todd and Michelle know the impact. They get it. And that's what, we just got to have a little moment where I'm just saying, you guys, that really helped us kind of keep moving forward. And they understood that. And especially Todd Stashwick is such a fan himself. He comes from such a fandom of that particular franchise and genre. They understood it. And so that is a moment where I did have kind of a heart to heart.
That's the one I think that's going to mean the most. Just to go up to someone and be like, I'm such a fan, doesn't have the same weight as the story that you told and the response that you got. And I'm sure also the experience of sitting down and watching those episodes with your family at that moment in time. Now, we are in a time where we're losing some Star Trek. Discovery is coming to an end. How do you feel like this will impact you personally, professionally, in terms of, would you write less about Star Trek once the show is over? How do you feel like how hopeful is your future, Scott? Oh God, that sounds terrible.
Well, we've really been in like kind of a glorious Star Trek renaissance. And it's Discovery, I feel like it's both kind of sad that it's coming to an end, but it also feels like it feels right. It feels like it's had the right kind of lifespan. It was a challenging version of Star Trek in that it was telling long arced out stories in a way that no other Star Trek series had.
And you don't want to drag it on and kill it because its quality diminishes.
Yep. And they were always in a tricky storytelling place, starting before original Star Trek, then leaping into the future. Like everything was a little tricky about that show, but they kept a consistent level of quality to it. And so what kind of comes in the wake of that? Because I think Strange New Worlds is as good as Star Trek show has ever been on. It's really, it hits every cylinder. Like it's kind of shocking to me how good that show is, and how much I started. We'll see when it's because they were going to start tinkering with characters and not ones that we know so well, but Spock was going to be there, and I'm like, you're walking on eggshells here with the fans, but they've done such a terrific job of it. Like another great job of casting. The writing is strong. The people behind it are deep fans. And then, Lower Decks, another one where I'm like, well, okay, let's try this out. Love it. Like perfect attitude, perfect respect for the franchise while tweaking it every possible chance that it can. So I think really the big question mark is the fate of the studios and where streaming is going to go. Is Paramount?
That's a great point because of what's happening with Paramount.
Is Paramount still going to be able to invest in this level of streaming series? They obviously, it's been out there that they decided to end Discovery a little prematurely, like based on what the cast and crew were expecting. And then in the movie side has, it's been going on for years. Them trying to, either restart the J.J. Abrams cast with something new or something from scratch. And like Quentin Tarantino put together an idea, and that still didn't get made. And it's
Yeah,
like,
I don't know. That seems like that might be. I'm not the biggest Quentin Tarantino fan. Also, I just feel like the tone of that might be very different.
oh yeah. And I think, to compare it, this is what my feelings were, is that since Tarantino wasn't going to like write and direct it himself, he just sort of conceptualized and had a writer's room.
Still, I don't know.
City on
I
the
wasn't
Edge,
as optimistic. Clearly, I'm not an optimist. I've said that already.
to bring it back to City on the Edge of Forever, that was
Yeah.
written by Harlan Ellison, one of the most cantankerous and troublesome but brilliant science fiction writers in the history of the medium. And he wrote a completely unshootable script by the rules of Star Trek. It was
Right.
great, but it was not by the rules of Star Trek.
Mhm.
And Gene Roddenberry and Gene Kuhn and the rest of the writing staff came in, hammered it into shape, pissed off Ellison, and complained about it for decades. But the end result was something better. And I figured that was probably what would happen with Tarantino's Trek, is like he'd have some wild, great, brilliant idea. They put together a writer's room and they would hammer it into Star Trek shape, and it would be a perfect synthesis. But we're probably never going to get it now. So I can only hope that they turn it into a, graphic novel or
Sure, yeah, different form. Or you could write something.
yeah, I could write a book about why
Right.
it did.
Well, a book, a script. I was going to say it feels like you're primed to write a Star Trek book.
Because it's also that Tarantino's idea was based on one of the more obscure episodes that I absolutely is in like my top 5 or 6 that I love. A piece of the action where they go to the gangster planet.
Okay.
And it's every indication decades before he got the opportunity that William Shatner could be very funny.
Mm.
Like he plays the comedy in it just right. It's a goofy episode, but it really works. It's very funny.
You know what I didn't ask you? What was the name of the episode that scared you as a child? And did you go back and rewatch it? And how do you feel about it now?
I still get creeped out when I watch it. It's the Man Trap.
Okay. Oh man, that was the name of the episode. Sorry. Okay. You did say the Man Trap
I
earlier.
believe it was the first actual episode to air. I might be getting that fact wrong, but I think it was the first episode, because I think the network was like, let's put on something with a scary monster, even though it wasn't the first episode.
Oh, like it wasn't, the production order was different. I hate when they do that,
Yeah,
but you're right. I mean,
like
it was the first episode of when you go online and you look up what is the first Star Trek episode, that's what comes up. But in production order, it probably was not the first. I see what you're saying. Yes.
Yep. Because McCoy's in it, and McCoy doesn't come on until like episode 2 or 3. Yeah. So yes, I have gone back. I have revisited. It still creeps me out.
Fair enough. Okay. You did. I wasn't kidding. You kind of skirted the "Are you writing a Star Trek book?" question, because I feel like you should, even if it's not like officially announced. Or do you have notes and things from your interviews that you feel like could be made into a book?
I have my notes. I know that they exist somewhere in a crash disk that I can recover. I don't have my long interviews with the original cast members that I did in 2009. I do have the print, the versions that ended up on people.com and stuff still exist. But I mean, I'll tip my hat on 2 things. There was a period, weirdly enough, this is something my wife Cynthia and I bonded on our first date. I was actively researching. I had this idea that I wanted to write a novel that took I was going to be called Red Shirts. Took all these like secondary, tertiary characters from the original series and like told their story during the framework of the original series. Like what was going on, kind of lower decks, but it wasn't so comedy oriented.
Right.
That was this idea, this wacky idea I had. Neither my wife nor I knew that each other had any sort of Star Trek fandom at all on our first date. And it wasn't until our drive back from our first stop on our first date, going to the restaurant that we were going to, that we had a long time to talk. And we got on this topic, and our interest in it, and basically in her family, Star Trek was like, a religion, that made us take each other more seriously. So whether I wrote the book or not, I got something really great.
I was going to say, I love that, because it's influenced you in so many different ways, professionally, romantically. Like
I proposed to Cynthia outside the set of the originals, where they shot the original Star Trek, in the Paramount lot. And of course, our dog is Nimoy.
He's like, no, thank you. Nobody paid my appearance fee.
Yeah, he's like, I don't do interviews before noon. But yeah, so it's been a huge part of our
Yeah.
both our lives. And yeah, the degree to which Star Trek has impacted me personally. Do I want to write a book about Star Trek? I do. I've also, I've really wanted to. There's so many great behind the scenes stories
Mhm.
and I really feel like there's a movie to be made about the making of the original Star Trek with sort of Gene Roddenberry as the central
Interesting.
character, but everybody has such interesting stories too
Mhm.
that I think it could be coalesced. That's something that I've given serious thought to. I
Yeah.
just I've been so busy for so long, but I'm finally like at a point where I'm able to look at these other kinds of projects
Yeah.
uh, and can give them some serious consideration because God knows I've got all the research.
Yeah, exactly.
I
And
still have all the books I bought when I was a teenager, like on the shelf.
oh, nice.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I should have asked you to put them out and display for the people watching on YouTube, but that's okay. I keep saying that whenever I do these interviews and people talk about like the merch or the swag that they get when shows are, giving away things to journalists. And then I'm always like, oh, we'll put them on social. And then we never remember to do that. To like, it's fine, whatever.
I need to dig out. I have my favorite thing that I have is I have a, a copy of Leonard Nimoy's biography.
Mm.
I Am Spock. He did two. One was I Am Not Spock, and then did I Am Spock. And when I interviewed him and Zachary Quinto together, I had them both sign it.
Oh, nice.
So I've got that's kind of a treasured one for
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you for coming on and sharing your stories, but also thank you for letting us promote your book that it's not out until October and it's, we know it's months away, but I I hopefully we can come back and talk about that again because it's such a different topic from Star Trek. And yet, I don't know, I feel like there's probably a little bit of crossover because Beverly Hills Noir, Crime, Sin, and Scandal in 90210, it's rooted in Los Angeles culture, but I'm sure there are themes and topics
And
maybe
there's
that
television afoot. Like I mean, we can talk about all the great Stephen Bochco shows I grew up watching,
Mm,
and David E. Kelly, um, and there's definitely the impact of television is felt in a couple of the stories I tell in this book as well.
awesome. All right. Well, for everybody who is listening slash watching, if you have been inspired to watch any of the Star Treks that we have talked about, they are available for streaming on Paramount Plus. And I do want to say that neither I nor Made Possible by Pop Culture get any sort of sponsorship or kickbacks for pointing you there. I just want to do it organically so that if you want to watch the things we talk about, you know where to find them. So thank you all for listening slash watching. Thank you, Scott, for being here. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll be back with another episode next week.